Hello guys! Today I want to talk about regenerative agriculture. Now, regenerative agriculture is a term that got popular in the 2010s as an umbrella term for a bunch of different farming practices that try to marry two pretty different ideas. One of these ideas is sustaining the living world around the farm, like the soil and the biodiversity, the water, that kind of stuff. And the other idea is trying to maintain or maximize crop outputs, so the actual profit that the farmer gets from the farm. And in combining these two ideas, we get to regenerative agriculture. Now, my interest in this topic is as an anthropologist, so I care about whether this is a useful framework for thinking about farming and thinking about social change. But my goal for you guys is just to start thinking about the politics behind farming and different farming practices. What kind of practices do we associate with good farmers or bad farmers? And what does that really mean? What kind of value judgments do we make? What kind of feelings do we attach? All these things are political and they're culturally situated. And my main idea for this video is don't take farming for granted. There's a lot that goes into it, from the side of the government, the side of the farmers, the side of the people who actually pay for produce. And start thinking about those complications when you make your own Minecraft farms and when you talk about and think about farming in your day-to-day life. So before getting into some of this big stuff like discourse and politics, I want to take us out into the field so that we can see some of these practices firsthand. Alright guys, so we are out in the field. I have chosen a lovely flower forest to demonstrate what I want to talk about. And I've made three versions of this world. One is just the naturally spawning Minecraft world, the way the developers intended. One is an industrial farm, and one is a farm that uses regenerative agriculture practices. So now that we've seen what the world should look like, why don't we go over to our farms and see how they compare. Alright, so this is that same flower forest we were looking at before, but now we have turned it into a big industrial farm. We have flattened out the land and we have fenced it off from any wild animals. We have planted a big field of wheat. We've gotten rid of all the rivers and stuff that were running through it. And this is kind of an ugly but pretty typical version of a Minecraft farm. You just plant one thing for as far as the eye can see, and you might get in some redstone or whatever, but this is it. This is the industrial farm. And the thing that I want to show you guys is what kind of biodiversity we've lost. Because this area used to be full of oak trees, birch trees, different types of grasses, tons of flowers. It used to have bees and pigs, cows, chickens. And what we have now is wheat. This is what we call a monocrop. And it's really bad for things like disease outbreaks. It's bad for the soil. But it's good in an industrial agriculture sense because we can just plant tons and tons and tons of wheat and make tons and tons and tons of money. By contrast, here we have our regenerative agriculture farm. And I want to go through and point out some of the different practices and ideologies that are running through this. Now, the first one you might see is that we're no longer planting wheat. And while wheat is useful, we're trying to move away from monocrops. So what we have instead here are a bunch of root vegetables. We have potatoes, beets, and carrots, because that's what we can show in Minecraft. Now, ideally, what we would be doing is using cover crops. The idea of cover crops is just to use something that shields the soil from the sun. So over here, we have what is basically the best cover crop system, which is the Three Sisters system. Now, I have had to use some mods and banners and stuff to represent this because Minecraft does not really support the idea of cover crops. Minecraft really, as a game, supports monocrops, but here we have it. So we have a stalk of corn growing. We have some beans that grow up the corn, so it's using it like a kind of lattice structure. And then we have some squash, or in this case pumpkins, with big leaves that shield the soil from the sun. And in doing this, all of these three crops can grow together, and this system will be less affected by disease, it'll be less affected by the sun, less affected by things like soil nutrient loss. It's a really good system that we just don't have in Minecraft. The other technique you'll see is that I'm using podzol. Now, podzol in Minecraft is basically made up of like dead leaves and pine needles. but I'm using it here to show animal-based manure, and this is another one of the practices that goes into this. We're trying to move away from industrial fertilizers and trying to move into using the byproducts of livestock. It also gets into no-till agriculture. So I mentioned soil health, and soil health is one of the things that is really, really emphasized by regenerative agriculture, and that's because it's what farmers rely on. Another thing we've got here is this water feature in the middle, and you can see that around it we have a little tree here, and we have bushes and flowers and plants and stuff. So this is one of the ways that we're trying to maintain biodiversity. We also have all of these bees around because we're trying to incorporate the pollinators that naturally come with this region of the world, the flower forest, and we're trying to incorporate them into the farming system. Additionally, another way to improve our biodiversity is that instead of planting a big old fence, we've planted a hedge. So a hedge is basically a big wall made out of plants. We're using a mix of oak and birch because that's what was indigenous to this area. And the last thing I want to point out is that over here we have some sheep. So we're trying to incorporate livestock, and you can see that they're also underneath trees. This is what we call silvopasture. But the important thing here is that instead of uprooting all of our trees and getting rid of our biodiversity, we are trying to still incorporate animals, but incorporate them within the natural biome that was already here. And if we fly back up here, you'll see that we have kind of maintained our biodiversity. So instead of just having wheat on this side, we still have the same starting point, but we have kept the sheep and the bees. We have kept a bunch of these flowers. We've introduced some new crops, so that might damage the environment in some ways, but we're putting in a lot of diverse crops. Diversity is a really big focus. And we've also brought in some azaleas. So those might be considered invasive to this area, but they also have their uses as part of the hedgerows. So we can see that there is a really big difference. Now, is this the future of farming in Minecraft and in real life? Well, I want to take us back to the classroom so we can start to unpack some of what we've talked about here. All right, so we are back in the class here, and I think it's time to unpack some of the stuff that we've been talking about, especially the more political side and even the more theoretical side. So at its basis, the kind of found regenerative agriculture is that it should provide a bunch of food that is nutrient dense and rich. It should increase the productivity of the soil. Like I said, there's a really big focus on the soil, which isn't really something that we have in Minecraft, as all soil is just dirt, basically. We are also trying to avoid synthetic fertilizers and biocides. So biocides means like a weed killer and things that kill bugs and pests and stuff. We're trying to be less environmentally destructive. We're trying to nurture relationships between the farm and the ecosystem around it. And we're also trying to increase things like employment rates and federal funding. Because one of the things about regenerative agriculture is that it is still embedded in a system of like farming for profit. That's still one of the really big discourses. And it's also one of the tensions that we're going to see between the competing discourses and the profits. No matter what we want to put into regenerative agriculture in terms of like policy changes, we have to fundamentally understand that nothing is going to change unless it is profitable or it costs as much as the old system used to cost. And this is just one of the things about farming. I mean, you can think about it in terms of your own Minecraft worlds. If I tell you regenerative agriculture is really cool, you should do it, and it's going to take hours and hours and hours to put into your worlds, you're going to say, no, I'm not doing that. But if I just say, oh, instead of planting a huge field of wheat, try not cutting as many trees down. Try putting a big barrier of leaves instead of fences, and maybe try planting a couple crops in the same space. It's mostly the same labor requirements. I'm not asking you to fundamentally do something that is beyond the kind of profit that you'd be getting out of it. I'm also talking a lot about discourses though. So what is a discourse? A discourse is a way of talking about a subject that produces knowledge, basically. Discourse is usually talked about in the sense of like academic discourse, medical discourse, legal discourse, and basically when institutions and people within institutions talk, they produce discourse. They talk about a thing and some sort of knowledge is produced in a way that we all kind of socially recognize. So, what are the kind of discourses in regenerative agriculture? Some authors say that there are 9 competing discourses, which is a lot, but we're going to try and break it down in a pretty simple sort of way. The first one is a restoration for profit, which just means you are trying to restore the ecosystem, especially in the soil itself, for the ability to then make more money from your soil because it's better quality. Pretty simple. We also have holistic discourses. So holism is the idea of trying to incorporate the land and the nature and employment and people and spirituality in one. So some people will focus more on like the spirituality of farming versus other people want to focus more on like big picture holism. It's just a way of saying that it's trying to be more considerate of all the different aspects of farming that go beyond the actual plants in soil. So this is trying to just incorporate a few more things. We also have regenerative organic and agrarian permaculture. So these are ideas like trying to see the farm as like an organism that you have to foster and take care of. A lot of regenerative agriculture bases itself on systems theory, which is pretty complicated, but the short of it is that the farm is operating like a system. It has certain inputs and certain outputs, and with regenerative agriculture, as opposed to typical industrial agriculture, you're just trying to be more aware of what you're actually inputting and outputting. And we also have First Nations discourses. So a lot of the things that we talk about in regenerative agriculture are things that have been done for thousands of years. I mentioned the Three Sisters before, and that is an indigenous way of planting crops. We didn't just come up with all of these types of practices and discourses out of the blue. A lot of them are founded on indigenous ways of planting and of interacting with the world. Especially, I mentioned those kind of holistic images. A lot of that is rooted in indigenous knowledge, and it's important to acknowledge that. And the last big thing that I want to talk about for these discourses is food sovereignty. And this is another one of the kind of competing tensions that we're going to see in discourse. So food sovereignty, the two parts: 1, food, being able to feed people, and 2, sovereignty, self-determination, being able to do something for yourself. So food sovereignty is the focus on trying to feed your community and be able to produce enough food that you don't have to rely on the outside world. This really applies a lot to places where it's hard to get a lot of food in. We can think about like the Inuit in northern Canada, or places that are kind of isolated, or even places that are just trying to reclaim their sovereignty because they've dealt so much with like food imports and cultural imports that they're a bit sick of importing everything that is important to their lives, and they want to do something different. So regenerative agriculture can try to incorporate some of these discourses in the hopes of providing more food to communities. Some authors see all of these discourses as really useful because regenerative agriculture is such like a big force that actually has real political change possibilities. For my part, I think it's kind of limiting, and I'm going to kind of explain why. So everywhere in the world has its own geography, and that is one of the big things I put up here: geography. What does regenerative agriculture look like in South Africa compared to Greenland? Can we use the same terms for those two types of farming? I think that it's trying to take on too much. I think regenerative agriculture is a bit more useful if we break it down a bit more into different terms. But from a kind of general public point of view, I think it is still really interesting. And it's still interesting, I think, from a Minecraft point of view, to think about the ways that our farms will influence the world. If every farm you do in Minecraft is just copy-pasted, no matter the biome or no matter what game like version you're playing on, you are kind of feeding into that industrial way of thinking about farming. I mean, even the language that we use in Minecraft, we always talk about redstone farms. We're talking about sugarcane farms or wheat farms. We're talking about iron farms or gold farms. We always use the language of farming in terms of trying to get resources. And that really has an effect. It's not like a completely politically neutral thing. And that is really my point with this video. Moving on a bit though to some of these other things, I think the measurements is an interesting one. So I've been talking about things like biodiversity and soil health, and some of you may have been thinking to yourselves, well, how do we measure these things? What is a good amount of biodiversity? How biodiverse does it have to be? What is soil health really? And the answer is, these things are all kind of made up. We decide them, right? People who have expertise in these subjects are part of organizations, and these organizations will talk with the government, and the government will talk with the farmers, and they will all kind of come to some understanding of what the levels should be and what they can be and what we can really force farmers to respect. Measurements are not politically neutral. A lot of farmers see these kind of ways of measuring as ways that the government or the public are trying to tell them how to do their jobs. If you've been farming the same way that your dad farmed and your granddad farmed for like 100 years, and somebody comes in and says, actually, no, the way that you're farming is bad for the soil, there's a kind of a conflict of interest there. And this is where measurements can get into reflexivity. So reflexivity basically means self-consciousness. It's the fact that we are not passive, we are always thinking about our place in things. Now, from a farming perspective, people get real reflexive about measurements. Some people will try to immediately agree with all the measurement systems and say, yeah, this is a good way of doing it, and I will change my ways. And other people will say, no, we have to go lobby the government and get the measurements changed. Again, thinking about your own Minecraft world. Do the farmers in your world like the way that they are governed, like as a political system? Is that a thing that people are mostly rejecting or accepting? Farming is not politically neutral, and if you have kind of civilizations in your Minecraft world, the farmers in those civilizations are not politically neutral people, they are political actors. The last kind of big thing that I want to talk about here is farmers' identities. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that there is an idea of, say, what is a good farmer or what is a bad farmer? And that's something that, again, farmers are people, they think about these things too. A lot of people described moving away from industrial agriculture as kind of like getting over an addiction. They say we were addicted to producing the most, we were trying to do too much all the time. And with regenerative agriculture, it's kind of a healing process. And like with addiction, some people try regenerative agriculture. They try it for 1 season, 2 seasons, and then like 3 years down the line, they might kind of relapse into industrial agriculture. They might say, well, it wasn't quite making the profits that I would have hoped, or we were promised a tax break for switching to this kind of farming, and it never really happened. We tried this kind of farming and it wasn't good for my soil. I thought it was going to be better, but it turned out that it didn't do what I wanted it to. So even on this kind of journey of people trying to be good farmers, we can still think about people as not being passive. They still are actors in certain ways, and sometimes they will relapse into old habits that are more profitable or more socially recognized as being good things. One thing that I think is really interesting is that a researcher called George Cusworth did a bunch of interviews in England with people and really focused on this generational divide between different farmers. A lot of the younger farmers were more accepting of bringing in regenerative agriculture practices, but some older farmers necessarily weren't super on board, and they started to get this thing where people were being pressured by their peers. So if, again, your family's been farming for a certain way for a long time, and you talk to a farmer who like knew your dad back in the 70s, And that guy's like, oh yeah, I mean, you switch to this new type of farming. That's kind of weird. I don't know why you would do that. Like that's kind of a sissy way to farm. You can get this kind of like peer pressure element to continue doing things the old way, but that can work the other way too, right? People can pressure each other into adopting new practices. People can say, oh, you're still farming like it's the 1950s. The post-war ended like a long time ago, dude. You gotta switch your ways. You gotta get with the times. So it is a very social thing. And people are aware of that, right? People are aware of the image that they have with each other. And they don't want to sabotage their profits, obviously, but they also don't want to sabotage their self-image and their image with their peers. So whether people adopt or reject these new types of agriculture is going to be kind of dependent on a lot of different things. Like I said, money, obviously, but also a lot of social things. Another thing that we might consider with geographies and, all these different things like government funding for switching to regenerative agriculture is, are people in the global south going to want to adopt these practices? So the global south is a kind of social science term for places in the world that have been historically damaged by colonialism. And in these places, if somebody from a global institution comes to your village and says, hey, we're going to pay you like $500 a year in order to switch to regenerative agriculture, is that a decision that person wants to make, knowing full well that their nation or their village or their community has been impacted by colonialism? Is that an easy decision to make? Again, we're still thinking about all those things we were before, like food sovereignty, food production, profits, self-image, peer image. But now we have another layer, which is colonial reproduction and how people choose to think about the kind of money offers that they get. So I want to conclude this video by kind of circling back to the beginning thesis, which is farming is not politically neutral. Regenerative agriculture is an interesting variation of farming, and it has a lot of benefits, right? It can improve biodiversity, it can improve soil health, which can be more productive for some farmers, but not necessarily everywhere. And regenerative agriculture likes to talk a big game about things like carbon output and the health of the ecosystem. But we have to remember that farms in the world take up only a kind of small amount of space, and ultimately, most of the work that has to be done into affecting the ecosystem is not on the backs of farmers. It is partially, and it is important to recognize these kinds of things. But even think about your own Minecraft worlds, right? I am recording this in the university of a town. If you look outside, you can see there's a big paper mill over there, and it's spewing toxins into the air. There's no way that a small farm outside of town is going to be doing as much damage as everything else in the town. It's too much to try to put those expectations necessarily on just the farm. These kind of initiatives for improving biodiversity have to also take place in the cities and in other rural areas that are not necessarily farmlands. But even the way that we construct roads is super destructive. So it's interesting to think through these things politically, and to think through our Minecraft worlds as ways that we might be reproducing certain types of politics, Even think about Mojang as a video game developer. What kind of crops did they put into the game? Well, they put in potatoes, carrots, beetroot, and wheat, basically. We also have pumpkins and melons and sugarcane. But Minecraft has never had rice. It has never had yucca or plantain. It has never had sweet potatoes or yams or a lot of these starches that other cultures produce. Minecraft is kind of a fundamentally Swedish game, and even though they've added things like bamboo and stuff in more recent updates, it still is kind of Eurocentric, and the types of things that it allows us to do in our games, in our worlds, those things are still pretty Eurocentric, to be honest. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. We have occasionally anthropological videos on this channel. This one is the most anthropological one I have done so far, but Everything on this channel is meant to be educational in some sort of way. So if you enjoyed, I hope you'll stick around. That's going to do it for today, guys. So yeah, see ya.